Boldwood presents The Simple Rules of Love, written by Amanda Brookfield and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. February. By the time the mourners followed the coffin out of St. Margaret's arched Norman doorway, the sun had burned the leaden screen of cloud to harmless grey tufts, which floated over the distant ridge of the South Downs like puffs of smoke. It had been a wet winter, and the grass of the churchyard, pitted here and there with clusters of daffodils, was long and lush, asserting more than words ever could that, though bodies might rot beneath it, life, on the surface at least, went on. The surviving members of the Harrison family, the edges of their dark clothes flapping in the brisk breeze, made their way slowly down the path and into the graveyard, moving with the seamless ease of a flock of gliding birds. They came to a stop in a sheltered corner by a hedge of ripening privet where a deep rectangular hole had been dug next to the other, variously weathered family graves. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The priest issued his valedictions in a tone of almost bored familiarity, casting a handful of earth, which caught on a gust of wind and blew back against his gown. As the coffin was lowered into the hole, Pamela Harrison, at 79, now the oldest living member of the family, found her attention drifting from the demise of her sister-in-law Alicia to the grassy mound that covered her husband's remains. After 2 years, the plot still looked new and plump, as if John had changed his mind and was trying to punch his way through the rows of winter pansies she'd planted on top, wanting a final gasp of air, or maybe the chance, so regularly sought in his life, to have the last word. With his ailing 83-year-old heart, death had been expected, but, for Pamela at least, none the less shocking. 6 decades of marriage had bound them together as firmly as the twisted roots of the old oak that guarded the entrance to the drive of Ashley House, their beloved family home on the other side of the village. Passing the tree as they set out for church that morning, Pamela had caught herself staring through the dots of her veil at its sprawling canopy of boughs, remembering how John had loved to sit beneath it, one hand cradling his pipe, the other absently stroking the silky ears of Poppy, the beloved bouncy Springer Spaniel who had replaced their old Labrador, Boots. Pamela had gripped her little black handbag as she studied the tree's heaving base of tangled roots, wondering at the surgical possibilities of removing just one, and how so old and convoluted a structure would respond to such an assault. For her own part, Pamela had concentrated on the dignified but wearisome business of continuing, discovering in the process the comfort of pursuing all the myriad daily routines that, at various times in her life, she had despised for their sameness. As she twisted her thinning white hair into its customary bun, walked Poppy up the lane, browsed through the paper in the drawing room, with the lavender visible through the windows and the inviting green mouth of the pergola beyond, she was aware that it was precisely the familiarity of these actions and their landscapes that held her together. They required no thought, thereby offering at least a semblance of the business of living. It was performing tasks beyond this routine that Pamela found hard, like choosing a hat for the funeral, a hat for John's rickety-hipped sister Alicia, who had clung to life with all the irascibility and obstinacy that had made her impossible to regard as a friend. Pamela had fretted for hours at her dressing table, hat boxes strewn across the counterpane of the bed, as paralysed with indecision as one of her fashion-conscious twin granddaughters. She liked hats and had several elegant black ones in various styles, with lace or without, wide brim or narrow, cocked to one side or straight. She'd still been deliberating when Charlie, her second son, had shouted up the stairs that it was time to go. There was an edge of impatience in his voice, so reminiscent of John that, for a few seconds, Pamela had imagined that her husband might be waiting for her in the hall, his face creased with frustration, his elbow ready to loop through hers for the walk to the car. She had seized the nearest hat and reached for the enamelled box that contained her hat pins. John would never wait for her again, she reminded herself. Charlie and Serena lived with her now, and Ed, their 17-year-old, who made the walls of Ashley House vibrate with his music, who used the old oak tree to shield the smoke of his illicit cigarettes, and who claimed so vociferously not to miss Maisie and Clem, his 20-year-old sisters, that it was obvious he longed for them all the time. Even now, the hat Pamela had chosen didn't feel right. There was a growing sore spot where one of the treasured mother-of-pearl hatpins was pushing through her bun into her scalp, and she'd pitched it so far forward that the brim now obscured the view of the sky and rolling hills, precluding what would have provided a welcome visual escape from the sombre expressions of those around her. She made do instead with looking at the ground. Next to John's grave, there was an empty patch of grass reserved for her. Pamela squinted at it through the fine gauze of her veil, trying to imagine the cold comfort of death, but thinking instead, with sudden yearning, of a nice cup of tea. "All right?" Peter, her elder son, patted her hand where it gripped his arm. He and his wife, Helen, had driven down from London that morning, electing not to bring their 4- and 13-year-old girls, Genevieve and Chloe, and apologising for the absence of Theo, their eldest, who was in the thick of his second term at Oxford. Pamela nodded, pressing her fingers into the soft cashmere of Peter's overcoat. With his wide, balding grey head and determined eyes, he was so like John at a similar age that every time she saw him these days, she wanted to weep at the complicated poignancy of life's relentless echoes, so comforting yet so disquieting. Her other 3 children, ranged among the small crowd on the opposite side of the grave, were less obvious physical replicas of their parents' union, though people often remarked that Cassie, still striking at 42 with her petite frame and long curly blonde hair, looked as she had in her prime. The middle 2, Charlie and Elizabeth, with their much heavier features, dark hair and wider girths, were like peas from an altogether different pod, apart from their eyes, which were blue and deep-set like her own. And Elizabeth had her father's chin, reflected Pamela, feeling a little spurt of fond compassion, as she always did for her somewhat clumsily assembled second child. In her long black coat, Elizabeth looked as close to smart as Pamela could remember. Only the thick-soled boots protruding from below the hem bore testimony to the faintly anarchic style she had adopted in recent years. A style that involved not only heavy-soled footwear, but layers of shapeless clothes and, on particularly misguided occasions, 2 thick, squaw-like plaits. It was no way for any woman to dress, in Pamela's view, least of all a 51-year-old secondary school maths teacher with an impressionable teenage son to consider. Dear Roland, Pamela sighed as her glance shifted to the 15-year-old, whose 6-foot frame towered above his mother and whose cheekbones jutted out under his huge, long-lashed brown eyes with a man-boy innocence she would have done anything to preserve. To be so handsome was almost unnatural and would lead to trouble, she was sure. As she watched, Elizabeth slipped an arm round Roland's waist and leant into him, resting the side of her face against his upper arm. Depending on him, as usual, Pamela noted with despair, marvelling as always at Roland's still unspoilt good nature, and that Elizabeth's split from Colin 5 years before seemed, contrary to all traditional wisdom, to have proved far less traumatic for the boy than for his mother. Elizabeth had rebounded, with predictably disastrous results, into the arms of her first husband, Lucian Cartwright, after which there had been a series of other unlikely characters, each promising much but delivering little. Pamela had seen it all coming, just as she could see that Elizabeth leant too heavily on her only son in consequence. She saw such things, but no longer tried to speak of them. Voicing opinions, no matter how accurate, changed nothing, she had discovered, especially if one was old, lacking in confidence and struggling, publicly now, with the disconcerting embarrassment of a failing memory. The funeral cars were waiting for them in the lane, their shining black bulks taking up almost the entire space between the church wall and the hedge on the other side. At the sight of them, Ed's spirits lifted. He nudged Roland, the only one of the cousins to have been subjected to the ordeal of their great-aunt's send-off, and made a face. We could do a royal wave through the streets of Barham, the lords of the manor returning to their country seat. He slung out an arm to demonstrate, accidentally catching his aunt, Helen's, ribcage with his elbow. "Whoops, sorry." "You two will probably go with Sid in the Volvo," said Helen sharply, absorbed not by any real irritation at her nephew, so much as a strong desire to get back to Barnes, where the demands of her 2 young daughters awaited her, along with a briefcase of work on a difficult deal for her law firm's latest, most prestigious corporate client. Fitting in Aunt Alicia's funeral had blown the week off course, just as she had known it would. Angling with Peter to be let off the hook, the demise of a prickly family ancient hardly constituted a tragedy, had got her nowhere. Peter, as was his wont on any matter relating to his family, had been intractable. A good turnout was essential, he said, to support his mother, not to mention Charlie and Serena, on whom would fall the burden of orchestrating the event. So here they were, and with the wake still to get through, God help her. It would be 7 o'clock at least before they got home. "Isn't Sid a bit on the doddery side for driving these days?" asked Ed, sliding his fingers through the quiff he had sculpted with some care that morning, using gel and a few blasts of his mother, Serena's, hairdryer. "From what I've seen, he can hardly manage a lawnmower." He cast a mischievous glance at Roland, hoping for a glimmer of approbation in his younger cousin's pale, grave face. As far as his own hardening adolescent heart was concerned, the best thing about Ashley House's old gardener, Sid was so long-serving that he was almost an honorary member of the family, was his granddaughter, Jessica, who lived in Wandsworth with her mother, but who was always popping down to Barham on one pretext or another. On this occasion, it was to help with the catering for the wake. As children, they had all found Jessica a pain. She would appear at Ashley House when she was least wanted, whining to join in their games and running to Sid with tales of their unkindness if they didn't let her. Lately, however, this same plump, whinging creature had re-emerged as a curvaceous 16-year-old, with a come-on smile and a taste for tight clothes. Ed had almost lost his footing on the stairs that morning, glimpsing her tottering along the hallway with a tray of glasses, wearing a mini-dress that paraded both her sizable chest and the outline of her knickers. "What do you reckon, Roland?" Ed pressed, cheered at the prospect of Jessica playing waitress once they got back to the house. "Should we trust creaky old Sid with our lives?" Roland's hands were in his pockets, and he was kicking a stone with the tip of his shoe. "Sid's okay," he murmured, shrugging his broad shoulders. He could feel the tension crackling between the adults and didn't want to make it worse. Nor did he care much which vehicle transported them back across the village. He would have been happy to walk. After the heavy smell of lilies in the church, the oppressive atmosphere of sorrow, it was a huge relief to be outside. Personally, he thought it a bit dumb that anyone should mourn the loss of a grumpy 80-year-old who, to his recollection, had always displayed a clear preference for television and Turkish delight over the company of her family. She had a nasty habit, too, of using her walking sticks to get attention, banging them on the floor or jabbing their rubber ends into her great-nephews' and nieces' shins and ribs so hard sometimes that Roland, as a small boy, had often swallowed tears. Church, in Roland's opinion, was also a lot of mumbo-jumbo. He far preferred the sound of religions where families partied at gravesides, quaffing wine and telling funny stories. He hadn't felt sad at all that morning, until they'd assembled at the graveside when he thought of his grandfather, whom he still missed, and his little cousin, Tina, whom he didn't, you couldn't pine for a toddler, but whose death 6 years before was still a vivid memory and, in his view, still a much more obvious cause for grief. He was sure that his aunt, Serena, nose in a soggy tissue for most of the service, was thinking far more of her dead daughter than of the witchy occupant of the coffin parked in front of the altar. He also suspected that his mother's tears had much more to do with being on her own and the fracas with Richard, her latest ex-boyfriend, rather than sadness about her aunt. He was on the verge of telling Ed he'd prefer to walk when Sid appeared round the side of the church, looking even more craggy-faced and rheumy-eyed than usual, jangling the keys to the Volvo. "I think you two are with me," he growled, so firmly that both boys barely exchanged a look as they followed him to the line of smaller cars parked further down the road. At the sight of Ashley House, crouched with its mossy walls and crowning glory of polished slates, waiting to greet them like a huge, shy friend, Peter felt a familiar wrench of affection. His decision, 5 years before, to hand the place over to his younger brother, Charlie, had been nothing short of momentous, but he'd not regretted it for a moment. For one thing, Peter didn't believe in regret. Life was about paths chosen. It was pointless to look back and play the game of what if, based on nothing but imponderables and hypotheses. For another, all the reasons behind the decision, neither he nor Helen wanting to commute, loving London and their spacious Barnes home, avoiding school upheaval for Chloe, recognising that Charlie and Serena, with their country ways, were far more the natural inheritors of this family jewel, still stood. Yet, dear God, he loved Ashley House with all his being. Built by his great-grandfather and lived in by Harrisons for 200 years, the house was an integral part of his childhood landscape, an attachment that went way beyond bricks and mortar. Since moving in, Charlie and Serena had kept the open house policy upon which they had all agreed. He, Cassie and Elizabeth still had their own bedrooms and visited often, but it wasn't the same, Peter reflected, as he helped his mother out of the car into the drive, noting with a scowl the precarious angle of the Cockerell weather vane and several loose slates on the garage roof. Had he been in charge, his perfectionism would have had him on to anything like that in a flash. Leading the way through the gate and down the steps to the front door, Peter couldn't help noticing other things too. The squeak of the gate hinge, a section of loose grouting in the garden wall, the unsightly eruption of 3 molehills on the front lawn, and wondered whether Charlie's idle streak or shortage of funds lay behind it. A talk was called for, Peter decided, easing off his mother's coat and handing it to Jessica, who was hovering nearby, clearly briefed to deal with such matters but too shy to say so. A brotherly chat, nothing too heavy-handed, ideally, if he could engineer it, over a pint at the Rising Sun that evening. "Let's not stay too long, darling," pleaded Helen, once Jessica, staggering a little under the coats, had turned for the stairs. Peter shot a glance of disappointment at his wife, observing that she looked tired. The shadows under her still striking brown eyes were as dark as fingerprints, and her usually kempt hair had been blown haywire by the wind that had gusted across the churchyard, tugging at their clothes like an attention-seeking child. Although she visited the hairdresser regularly, the grey showed through quickly these days. Thanks to the assault of the February breezes, it was clearly visible now, crusty patches of white along her hairline and parting, as if dabbed there by an inexpert painter. In fact, she looked old, Peter realised with some dismay, for some reason recalling suddenly the wholly uncharacteristic fervour with which she had appeared to pray in church, fingers locked, eyes cast down, lids trembling, as if she was seeking something. Usually she stared straight ahead, as he had, in a pose of respectful but defiant agnosticism. "But, Helen, we haven't been here since Christmas," he pointed out, his expression softening. "In fact, I was thinking of staying the night. It would do us both good, don't you think? A night out of town?" "Staying the night?" repeated Helen, her voice shrill. Jessica, halfway up the stairs, paused to peep through the carved oak spindles of the banister. "Of course you can stay," Serena assured them smoothly, catching a thread of the conversation as she emerged from the kitchen into the hall. "You know you're always welcome," she added, while her mind leapt, with rather less enthusiasm, to the dusty, unready state of Peter and Helen's room. And she would have to change her scribbled order to the milkman too, from 3 pints to 4, or maybe 5, if Roland and Elizabeth ended up staying too, which was quite likely, given the gusto with which her elder sister-in-law appeared to be tucking into the wine. "No, thank you, Serena," replied Helen. "It was just a lovely but impossible idea of Peter's." "Impossible?" Peter snorted with irritation, all tenderness forgotten, his blue eyes blazing in a way that regularly made juries sit to attention, no matter how hopeless the position he was defending. Even Jessica, who was used to being in the thick of much uglier confrontations, took a step back on the landing, using her bundle of coats to shield all but her green eyes and high forehead, ivory white against her freshly dyed black hair. There was an undeniable buzz in watching people you didn't like fighting with each other, she decided, especially when they were unaware of it and you didn't give a toss about the outcome. Serena, who did care about that outcome, decided it would be best affected by her absence. "Just let me know. We'd love to have you," she murmured, hurrying through to the drawing room, grateful that she'd fallen in love with the infinitely less fierce second son, Charlie, and thinking how baffling the behaviour of other couples could be, even those one had known and loved for 2 decades. "I just meant," persisted Helen, too used to her husband's quick temper to be cowed by it, "that we ought to get back for the girls. It's Friday and we have a nanny, don't we? A nanny who has the evening off and is going to the cinema. Who always has the evening off when we need her." Peter tweaked his starched shirt cuffs, one eye on the doorway into the drawing room where everyone else had already gathered. He could hear the spit and crackle of the freshly lit fire, laid by Sid, no doubt, that morning, and Charlie's booming laugh from the far end of the room. "Well, perhaps I could stay then, catch the train up tomorrow. Would that be all right?" He couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "Of course, and don't be such a crosspatch," Helen scolded, sealing her peace offering by brushing a fleck of something off his suit, then adjusting his tie. Peter grunted to acknowledge the truth, feeling, with his chin lifted and his wife's deft fingers at his collar, both cornered and mollified. "I would stay if I could," Helen added, stepping back to admire her handiwork with the tie, too relieved at the resolution of the dispute to question whether this was true. It was certain, though, that without Peter her evening would be infinitely more productive. She could snack instead of preparing a proper meal, then sit up in bed with her papers as long as she liked, glass of wine in hand, with the prospect of sleep uninterrupted by thunderous snores. With the chairs and side tables pushed against the walls, the drawing room offered almost too large a space for the 30 or so assembled guests to lose themselves comfortably. A smaller room would have pressed them all together, forcing jollity and cohesion. As it was, they stood in small, awkward groups, islands amid the sea of blue Axminster, making small talk and picking food off passing trays like timid strangers. In the broad stone jaws of the hearth, with its handsome fluted black marble surround, Sid's expertly laid fire lashed and burned vigorously, looking spectacular, but belting out so much heat that Serena, with a surreptitious glance at her mother-in-law, who liked greenhouse temperatures all year, hurried from radiator to radiator, turning them down. Even so, the line of garden windows overlooking the veranda, known in family parlance as the cloisters, each like a miniature stage framed with pairs of heavy blue velvet curtains, was soon misted. Almost, mused Serena, pausing to rub a porthole in one with a tissue, as if the spring mist, now seeping towards the house from the South Downs, had found cracks in the walls and crept inside. The thought made her shiver, in spite of the heat. She was getting a headache, she realised, pressing the wet tissue to the bridge of her nose, which still felt blocked from crying. The tears had started with the opening hymn, abide with me, then continued to pour throughout the service. Like a sluice gate opening, letting all the old sadnesses flood out. Missing John, Charlie's lovely dad, and her own mother, felled by cancer years before. And of course, Tina. Always Tina. Her darling, toddling youngest child, loved and lost 6 years before, thanks to a speeding motorbike. Time helped, but there was no healing, no forgetting. In the church she had found Charlie's hand and squeezed it, taking comfort from knowing he felt everything she did, that they helped each other to bear it. Now she felt a lot better, despite the headache. Crying always helped. Purging or something. Serena smiled to herself and then at Charlie, who was springing round guests with a bottle in each hand, his unruly hair even wilder than usual and his funeral ties slung over one shoulder. Every so often he reached with his free hand for an absent tug at his waistband, clearly forgetting that he was in a new fat phase, so his trousers had no alternative but to slip down to his hips, defeated by the substantial bulge of his belly. After Tina, he'd taken up running and got rather slim. Serena had been equivocal about it, even at the time, feeling dimly that a part of him was literally running away from her, from their grief. When the weight had begun to creep on again, she'd rather relished reacquainting herself with his teddy bear bulk, the lovely sensation of being small in his arms. Aware suddenly that a few people were staring at her, alone by the window, Serena crossed the room to go and see to things in the kitchen, tossing her wet tissue into the fire as she passed. Roland, seeing the tissue land, went to watch it burn, a brief, livid yellow bundle, before it was swallowed up by the blackened logs and coal. Ed, joining him, started lobbing in paper napkins until their uncle, Peter, tersely suggested they find less childish and more useful occupations than setting the chimney on fire. As Charlie worked hard to link the still stranded groups with cheery remarks and offers to top up glasses, he could feel perspiration spreading across his forehead and back. He glanced to the gilt-framed portrait of his father, which hung above the fireplace, dominating the room, and couldn't help thinking that the old man would have managed the occasion better, seeing to every detail with his usual, often irksome fastidiousness, asserting himself, exuding the quiet, infectious confidence of the truly self-assured. Was he just an imposter? Charlie wondered suddenly and with uncharacteristic bleakness, pausing, bottles in hand, to meet John Harrison's penetrating gaze. For a moment, it felt as if they were locked in one of those blinking games he'd once played with his siblings, staring each other out till their lids ached and their eyes streamed. "All right, old thing?" Charlie blinked and turned to see his elder brother's broad, earnest face softened with affectionate concern. "You were lost there for a minute." "I was," Charlie grinned. "Do you think the old man's watching over us or thinking we're making a botch of things?" "Of course not. And here, let me take charge of one of these." Peter seized the bottle containing red wine, partly because he wanted some himself. "By the way, I was thinking of staying the night, if that's okay. Thought we might treat ourselves to a pint in the village later, if you're up for it." "Fine, yes, great. Did you, mention it to Serena by any chance? For catering purposes and so on?" "I did indeed," replied Peter, doing a faux formal click of his heels before setting off with the bottle. Charlie remained where he was, torn between gratitude at his elder brother's unfailing pragmatism, his ability to take command, and a dim sense of having been outmanoeuvred. He watched Peter launch into the role of genial host with which he himself had been struggling, breaking into a little throng of Alicia's bridge-playing friends, then approaching their sister, Elizabeth, who was standing alone by the table of family photographs staring at them as if they were a gallery of strangers. Peter said something to her, and Elizabeth's face lit up. Observing the exchange, Charlie's spirits lifted. He might have his wobbly patches, but Peter would hold it all together. He always did, Charlie reflected fondly, recalling the inspirational dry-eyed determination with which his elder brother had helped to shoulder Alicia's coffin that afternoon, just as he had helped to bear the body of their father 2 years before. He had stood tall and stoical while the rest of them bowed their heads and dabbed at their faces with handkerchiefs. And giving him Ashley House. Christ! Charlie experienced a fresh, dizzying rush of gratitude at the extraordinary magnitude of the gift. Announced a couple of years before the death of their father, while he and Serena were still in the thick of grief after losing Tina, the family home had dropped into their laps like a lifeline, a way forward without which they might have drowned. Pamela stood for as long as she could, listening but not hearing as Alicia's son, Paul, told her about life in Canberra. She nodded, as if his words meant something, but inside she fought vainly to merge the tanned, paunchy-faced man in front of her with the pale, shy 25-year-old who'd left England 40 years before, breaking his mother's heart. Alicia had never said as much, of course. One didn't talk about such things in those days. But that was when the acerbity had started, the closing of the door on friendship. She'd been jealous, probably, Pamela mused now, losing her one child to Australia, while Pamela and John had 4 to fill their hearts and their beautiful Sussex home with clatter and energy. "I think I need somewhere to sit down," she said, even though Paul was in mid-sentence. "I have a bad back," she explained, looking round for the sofa, which had been moved from its usual place in front of the fire to a stretch of wall between the old Georgian bookcase and a cabinet of ornaments. "I never used to," she added. "John was the one. Terrible episodes with his back over the years, not that he liked to admit it. And you know, ever since he's been gone, virtually from the day he died, in fact, I get this pain in the middle of my spine, almost as if—" She broke off, aware that Paul's round face was sinking in bafflement. "I'll see you shortly," she murmured, turning away and heading towards the sofa. And it was baffling, she mused a few moments later, sinking into the embrace of the big fat cushions with a sigh of relief. And perhaps insane, to imagine that a pain could be passed on, bequeathed like a piece of jewellery or a house, when it was just the crumbling of her ancient vertebrae. Seeing Jessica advancing across the room with a tray of asparagus rolls, Pamela leant back and closed her eyes. The funeral had drained her. She might not miss Alicia per se, but with her sister-in-law gone, she felt fragile and exposed, like a last flower standing up to a gale. Annoyed at the old biddy blanking her out, feeling like a troublesome insect, Jessica took her offerings to Cassie and her fiancé, Stephen Smith, instead. The pair had positioned themselves by the largest of the windows overlooking the garden and were using the windowsill to sort through a stack of white envelopes. "Oh, Jessica, thank you." Cassie took a roll, waited for Stephen to take one too, then started to eat. Jessica was about to move on when Cassie seized her arm and announced to Stephen, through her mouthful, "Darling, you remember Jessica, don't you? Sid's granddaughter. She used to play with my nephews and nieces." "Of course. Nice to see you again. Good of you to help out." "Yeah, right." Jessica blushed, unsure how to respond, given that she was being paid for her services rather than performing them as an act of charity. "We're getting married," gushed Cassie next. "Did you know?" "Yeah, Mrs. Harrison told me. That's great. Are they the invites?" "These?" Cassie glanced at the envelopes. "Oh, no, they're for our engagement party. The wedding isn't going to be until next year. January, we've decided, as the deadline for Stephen's new book is Christmas, and we think a winter wedding, if done properly, could be lovely, don't we, darling? The thing is," she continued, before Stephen had had a chance to reply, "what with the funeral and so on, we were wondering whether it really was the moment to give out these invitations, whether it might look a bit unfeeling. What do you think?" Jessica gripped her tray, alarmed at having her opinion sought. "I think people always want a party, don't they? A reason to let their hair down, have some fun." The pair nodded happily and exchanged a look that made Jessica feel it was more than time to move on. She scanned the room, and, with only one asparagus roll left on the tray, her eyes alighted on Ed. He was crouched in a corner, rifling through a stack of CDs in front of the mahogany unit that housed his parents' music centre. He stood up as she approached, grinning and shaking his head at the tray. "Not for me, thanks. I'm stuffed." He slapped his hand to his stomach, drawing attention to his untucked shirt and revealing a couple of inches of white skin. "What are Mum and Dad paying you, if you don't mind me asking?" "I bloody do mind. It's none of your bloody business." "Use language like that and they may not pay you at all." "Bollocks." Jessica took a bite of the last remaining canapé and dropped it back onto the tray with a grimace. "Gross." Ed laughed. "Asparagus. I hate it too. Makes your pee smell. Did you know that?" Jessica giggled. "No way. Hey, you couldn't get us another glass of wine, could you?" "I might," she replied archly, not enjoying the reminder that she was at everyone's beck and call. She snatched Ed's empty glass and took the nearest route back to the kitchen, through the adjoining door to the music room, with its soft green carpet and black monster of a piano, and out again into the bit of hall that ran past the downstairs cloakroom. The house was somehow as giant and grand as a museum, but also sort of homely, with furniture that was posh but also used-looking and comfy, like the deep armchairs in the TV room and the big yellow sofa in the kitchen, which was easily as big as her mum's bed. Jessica couldn't look at it without wanting to kick off her shoes and wallow around in its huge, baggy cushions. Entering the kitchen now, Jessica gave an involuntary sigh of pleasure. As a small girl, she'd spent many happy hours in here, sitting on her grandfather's lap usually, nibbling biscuits while he swigged his mid-morning cup of tea and chewed at the end of an unlit roll-up. She remembered hiding once under the big oak table, peeping out from between the chair legs, pretending she couldn't hear him calling, pretending the table was her own grand house, not wanting ever to be found. Even now, with the grown-up perspective that made everything seem smaller, she noted that the table remained big enough to provide a roof for several people. The rest of the place? The huge quarried floor tiles, the gleaming blue arga in the old fireplace, the two stainless steel sinks, the oak cabinets and the marbled surfaces connecting it all together, was like something out of one of those glossy magazines with pictures of houses and swimming pools that made you wish you could dive into them and leave all the crap behind. Completing the picture of perfection, Samson, the elderly ginger Tom, was curled up on the back of the sofa in a pool of sunshine, his head on his paws, tail tucked round him like a draft excluder. Jessica, who didn't much like cats, kept a wary eye on him as she poured wine into Ed's glass and took a good long swig. Dogs were better, she thought, remembering the sweet old Labrador called Boots who died a few years before, and feeling a stab of pity for Poppy, whom she could hear yelping in indignation at her enforced confinement in one of the garden sheds. "You're a lucky puss," she muttered darkly, taking another gulp of Ed's wine, tempted suddenly to throw a cloth or cork at the cat to disturb things a little, make them more real. "Ah, there you are," exclaimed Serena, sternly enough to indicate that she'd seen the hasty lowering of the wine glass. Allowances had to be made, she told herself, tugging the oven gloves off the Arga rail and bending down to check the trays of sausage rolls and vol au vent she'd put in to heat earlier. They were employing Jessica as a goodwill gesture to Sid, she reminded herself, and because they'd heard enough over the years to recognise that it was something of a miracle the child was still in one piece, let alone capable of working hard to earn a living, which he most certainly had been. "Could you take some of these into the drawing room?" she asked sweetly. "And thank you so much. You're doing such a good job." Jessica watched, chewing her lower lip and feeling awkward, as Serena tipped the pastries onto a large serving plate decorated with blue and gold flowers. "Pretty, isn't it?" her employer murmured, pausing to stroke the edge of the plate. "Hand-painted, an ancient wedding present from some distant relative to my husband's grandparents." Jessica smiled politely, though inwardly she felt cross about the glare she'd received for swigging the wine. One drink was hardly a big deal. In the same instant, she recalled how bloody amazing she'd once thought all the Harrisons were, with their big house and polite talk. It wasn't until she hit her teens that she realised the only difference between her and them was money and all the good fortune it brought with it. She didn't think any of them were amazing now, except perhaps Ed, whom she'd always liked best, ever since he had devoted an entire July afternoon to teaching her how to do kick-ups with a football. She was sure he'd have forgotten it now, and in a way, she hoped he had because she'd been so useless. Anything to do with sport and bits of her body tried to go in different directions. That day, Ed had persisted for hours in spite of these handicaps, being funny and patient and kind, and telling Roland and Chloe to piss off when he spotted them spying and giggling behind a bush. Even now, 5 years on, the memory of that hot afternoon, the pleasure and pride of being defended by Ed with his skinny legs and Arsenal shirt, made Jessica feel funny inside. The change in him since those days was remarkable. The skinny legs had thickened and lengthened so that now he was several inches taller than his dad. The football strip had been replaced either with the smart suit trousers he was wearing that day or loose-fitting jeans, slung so low on his hips that he looked like he had no bum at all and exposing a good 4 inches of his underpants. He had one of the latest phones too, one that could go online as well as take pictures, and a mini iPod with neat little white headphones that would cost Jessica half a year's worth of Saturday wages, if she could be bothered to save for that long. All of which made the old feeling of liking him more complicated. Part of her wanting to tell him to go to hell, while another part didn't because he was right to think he was cool. In spite of his pricey clothes and expensive gadgets, he was never remotely stuck up like his cousin Theo could be, or his twin sisters for that matter. She remembered them going round the place all right, holding hands, sniggering behind their long hair like members of a secret club. "Wow," remarked Ed when she returned with his drink. "My lucky day, is it?" "Might be," Jessica grinned, enjoying the way he was looking at her. "I was thinking of slipping off to the pub later. Do you want to come?" "Dunno," she frowned, anxious suddenly, feeling closer to 6 than 16. "Granddad's cooking tea, and then I've got to get the train back to Wandsworth. I work Saturdays in a hair salon." "Do you? Mine will need a cut soon. Would you be up to that?" Ed ran his fingers through the vertical wall of his fringe, keeping an eye on her expression. The ratio of girls to boys at the Chichester Sixth Form College where he persuaded his parents to let him do his A-levels had proved disappointingly uneven. The decent ones had boyfriends already. The rest were unappealing, boring or tediously conscientious, particularly now with their exams just a few months away. Jessica, with her lippy comebacks and Saturday job, was a breath of fresh air. "Cut that lot," Jessica giggled, playing for time, reluctant to tell him that all she ever did was run the broom over the lino and wash the thinning scalps of the purple rinse brigade. She was still deciding how to answer when Charlie, concerned for the canapes, tapped her shoulder and suggested she circulate a little more widely. "And you should be helping to look after our guests," he scolded Ed, giving his son a fond rap on the head. "Instead of flirting with a waitress. Have a word with your Uncle Peter while you're about it. He's kindly offered to look into a work placement for you in the holidays. I know law might not be your thing, but it would look good on your CV and might help you make up your mind about university courses." "Great," said Ed, doing his best to look earnest, but wanting only to avoid a parental diatribe on his lack of plans for the next 4 years. He couldn't think beyond his A-levels, which loomed in view like a range of mountains, blocking out anything on the other side, good or bad. A recent school careers talk on the armed forces had stirred dim thoughts of joining the Royal Marines or even the SAS, but not convincingly enough for him to share them with anyone else. "Ed?" His father was still standing, arms akimbo, like some sort of bodyguard, waiting for him to move. "I'm going, okay? Unless you want me to leave these like this." Ed gestured at the fallen pile of CDs, as if their state of disarray was a matter of profound concern, when all he really felt like doing was giving them a good hard kick, a gesture of his annoyance at being treated like a 5-year-old. Pamela, still on the sofa, was experiencing the horrible blankness that came over her when she was tired. A stream of kindly people had taken it in turns to talk to her. First, Cassie's nice young man, Stephen Smith, who'd written the book about war heroes, including a chapter on Dear Eric, but who now wrote crime novels, though she couldn't remember any of the titles. Then Cassie, radiant as a bride-to-be should be, brimming with impossibly detailed questions about her and Stephen's wedding plans. Should the marquee be attached to the cloisters or stand free on the main lawn? Would the banns have to be read at St. Margaret's as well as at her and Stephen's local church in Camden? How many heaters would they need to shield 200 people from the inclemency of January? Was velvet appropriate for bridesmaids' dresses? Pamela had done her best, regretting that she was too weary to manage the proper mother-daughter repartee owed to such a momentous subject. She regretted, too, that her youngest had taken so long to decide on her Mr. Right that John would not be there to walk her down the aisle. "Mum, did you hear what I said?" "Oh, Cassie, darling, yes, of course. I was just thinking about all those clever detective stories Stephen writes and how that would have thrilled your father. He loved a good book." "Yes, he did," Cassie had sighed, masking impatience by the sound of it, and then pressed a starched white envelope into Pamela's hand. "Something for you. We debated long and hard as to whether to hand them out today, then thought it would give everyone something to look forward to. It's a housewarming too, though we haven't put that on the invitation." Pamela, unsheathing the gold-embossed card announcing the engagement party, had struggled to look pleased. "How lovely," she had murmured, kissing Cassie's cheek, but not managing to think beyond the 2 long car journeys that a party in London would entail. How her spine and bladder would ache, and all so that she could endure the strain of feeling left out or in the way. 2 of Alicia's bridge companions had approached to offer thank yous and goodbyes. Mabel and Iris, or had it been Mavis and Irma? Pamela closed her eyes, experiencing a sharp stab of fear at the way the edges of her life were losing their certainty. Contrary to all the platitudes about time and healing, life without John, for all her creature comforts, was definitely getting harder as the months and years ticked by. She longed more and more for the world they had shared for 6 decades, a world of distinct shapes and sequences in which she had felt both commanding and at ease. Charlie and Serena were kind, but it wasn't the same. Nothing was the same. Her forgetfulness didn't help, of course, descending always when she was tired, and could most have done without it. At such times the simplest words or thoughts could sit tantalizingly unreachable in some dark corner of her brain. Remembered but not remembered, like a confused dream. When Pamela opened her eyes, Roland was sitting next to her. "Hi, Gran." "Roland, darling, you sweet soul." Pamela grasped his hand and squeezed it, fighting the urge to cry at the sight of him, so grown up and beautiful. "I miss you, darling," she said tremulously. "I loved it when you and Mummy lived at Ashley House." Roland smiled patiently. This was a familiar theme. The period to which his grandmother referred had been when he was 10 and hadn't lasted long, and they'd not lived in Ashley House but had lodged in the converted barn that everyone called the Shack until the settlement of his parents' divorce, when he and Elizabeth had moved to a cottage near Midhurst where he now went to school. "We liked it too, Gran, but we're not far away, are we?" "No, and you visit us whenever you can, I know." Pamela let go of his hand and stared at the sea of faces in the room, all of them suddenly looking disconnected and unfamiliar. "Are they all here?" "All who, Gran?" "The other children, your cousins?" Having struggled to find the word, Pamela released it with a little gasp. She kept her gaze pinned on Roland's kind brown eyes, aware that she was having one of her bad patches and willing him to help her out of it. "Ed's here," said Roland gently. "He's over there, talking to Uncle Peter." He pointed across the room. "Oh, yes, of course." Pamela hesitated, listing Charlie and Serena's 4 children in her mind. But no longer 4, she reminded herself, because darling baby Tina had been killed by that hateful motorbike. which left the twins, Maisie and Clem, 19 now, or was it 20? And, Maisie and Clem, are they here? Sometimes the fact that his grandmother was old enough to be losing her marbles made Roland feel too sad to try to talk to her. At others, it simply tried his patience. But since Ed was being antisocial and the grown-ups boring, he did his best, telling Pamela things she knew already, content to be talking to someone instead of staring into space with his orange juice. Maisie's gone to Mexico to teach English, but she's coming back in the autumn to go to university. Clem is... Roland tailed off. Clem, as he had discovered from several overheard snippets of conversation between their adults, was a cause for concern. Unlike her twin sister, and in spite of equally excellent A-level grades, Clem had shunned the notion of further education and traded the comforts of Ashley House for a poky flat in Camberwell, where she divided her time between working in a wine bar and singing in her boyfriend's band. Which sounded fine to Roland. Hopeless at exams himself, he'd already set his heart on heading to London and art college. When the dullness of country life got him down, he sometimes fantasized about what making such a move would entail. Sharing digs with Clem, perhaps, or wearing outrageous clothes and shaving interesting lines into his hair. He was fond of all his cousins. To him, as an only child, they were almost like siblings. He'd spent many happy hours sharing rooms and bath water with them all during family sojourns at Ashley House when his grandparents, instead of his aunt and uncle, had been in charge. Clem, in spite of her moods, had always been a favourite. She didn't talk much, but she didn't make demands either. Not like Maisie, with her know-it-all defiance, or Theo, with his seriousness and scary brain power, more like a middle-aged man than a 19-year-old. Clem couldn't make it, he said eventually, and Theo's in Oxford. Seeing bewilderment cloud Pamela's face, he rounded off this summary with the observation that Theo's two little sisters, Chloe and Genevieve, had stayed at home in Barnes with Griselda, their nanny. "But you're here," said Pamela, clinging with some desperation to this simple fact, fearful of the darkness awaiting her on the other side. "I'm here," echoed Roland. He let his eyes drift from the imposing portrait of his grandfather to a much smaller still life on the wall behind the sofa. A vase of pink roses, 2 oranges, and a pear. The colours were electric, but the objects looked as if they were floating in mid-air, revolving around each other like planets in search of a moon. A bad picture, Roland had always thought, relishing each time the certainty of his opinion. Many things in life left him giddy with doubt. Subjunctive verbs, his mother's mood swings, the recent alien feel of his childhood friend Polly's tongue in his mouth. But when it came to art, the ground felt solid. With art, he just knew things, like where to move his pencil or brush on the paper, which colour to mix with which, where and how firmly to press his thumb into a lump of clay to tease out the life crouching within. His grandmother had fallen asleep. Her chin lolled onto her chest, and loose wisps of thin white hair from her bun were falling over her face. Roland reached out a hand to nudge her awake, then withdrew it. She looked a little silly, but also rather peaceful, he decided, slipping a small cushion behind her head instead. By the time Helen set off for London, it was already quite dark. Peter, waving her off without having gone to the bother of a coat, shivered with cold. He watched until the rear lights of the car disappeared round the bend in the lane, then stood in the drive for a little longer, his jaw and fists clenched against the icy February night, while his heart swelled with a curious blend of pleasure and dissatisfaction that seemed to characterize so much of the business of being a father to young children. Each morning, escaping the melee of breakfast and school run, he sat in the leather seat of his BMW, tuned into the Today programme, and felt a similar confusion. At once regretful that he wasn't indispensable, and grateful that, with the formidable organisational skills of Helen and Griselda, he didn't have to be. Now, turning back to the house, Peter found himself fondly picturing the scene as it would unfold in their handsome Barnes home that evening. Genevieve catapulting her tea across the table, and Chloe flouncing, as only Chloe could flounce, about television or sweets or how late she could stay up. Bewildered by how he could long for something yet at the same time experience such gratitude to be absent from it. The steps down to the front door were slippery with evening frost. Peter felt his way gingerly, holding on to the slim tree trunk Sid had erected as a handrail, and pondering what wonderful, incomprehensible things families were. Millstones one minute and life-saving anchors the next. He would call Helen later, he decided, apologize again for being short-tempered. He would try to explain how wanting a night away didn't mean he wouldn't miss them, how nothing, not even Ashley House, was quite the same without them at his side. Peter grinned when Cassie emerged from the drawing room with her arm looped through Stephen's. He'd always had a soft spot for his little sister, the baby of the family, no matter how their respective ages advanced. The relief and pleasure that at last she should have found the man with whom she wanted to share her life was beyond words. When she'd asked him, that afternoon, pulling at his sleeve and whispering shyly, if he would walk her up the aisle, he'd been almost too choked to speak. "Off so soon?" he exclaimed in dismay, noting that they were already in their coats. "Afraid so. Lots to do and all that." Cassie released Stephen's arm and gave her brother a hug, having to reach up because even though she was in her high-heeled suede boots, he was so much taller. "But you're coming to our party, aren't you? You and Helen?" "Of course," Peter assured them warmly, shaking Stephen's hand. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." "It's not just to celebrate us and our new house," explained Cassie happily. "Stephen's just signed a new contract for 3 more books." "Cassie, really? Have you, Stephen? That's fantastic. Congratulations." Peter turned to his soon-to-be brother-in-law with genuine admiration, liking the man all the more for having made no mention of this news during their various exchanges that afternoon. Coping with the Harrisons en masse couldn't be easy for anyone, he reflected, let alone a quiet sort like Stephen, who, from what Cassie had told them, had nothing comparably rowdy or solid in his own background. "More detectives?" "Still the same one, I'm afraid. Good old Jack Connolly." Stephen made a face. "Nothing to threaten the Booker shortlist. Pays the bills, though," he added, offering the sort of man-to-man look that he knew would be appreciated, while anxiety about his capacity to steer his character through yet more implausible adventures churned in his mind. "Okay, who's ready for a pint?" called Charlie, striding along the hall to join them, battling with the inside-out arms of a tatty brown anorak. "Lizzie and Roland have already scuttled back to Midhurst. Ed cycled off to a friend's house, and Serena says she's too whacked to go anywhere." "We're away too, I'm afraid," said Cassie, blowing him a kiss as Stephen steered her out of the front door. "So that leaves you and me." Charlie beamed at his brother. "I thought we'd walk unless—" He glanced at Peter's smart leather shoes. "You'd prefer to drive. Trouble is, I reckon I'm already over the limit. Christ, funerals give me a thirst. Black hats, doom and gloom, ghastly things." "I'll drive," said Peter at once. "It's freezing out there, and I've only had 1 drink." Crossing the landing to fetch his coat, Peter noticed that the door to his mother's bedroom was open and the light on. She was lying on her back, fast asleep, a cup of untouched murky tea on the table next to her. Peter studied her for a few minutes, tenderness flooding his heart. As he was reaching to turn off the light, her eyes fluttered open. "John?" "No, Mum, it's Peter." "Oh, darling, of course. Just for a moment I thought... So silly." She closed her eyes again, so quickly and heavily that Peter, switching out the light and closing the door quietly behind him, wasn't sure she'd been awake. Ed, cigarette in one hand and pint in the other, had a fraction of a second in which to register the appearance of his father and uncle before he ducked into the corridor by the phone box and lavatories. Jessica, similarly equipped but with a Bacardi and Coke instead of beer, didn't react so quickly. She looked at Ed's disappearing back and then at the bar, uncertain what to do. Catching Peter's eye, she waved, and Charlie waved back. "All right over there?" Fine, thank you, Mr. Harrison. On your own? I was meeting this friend, only he didn't turn up. Lying, Jessica had discovered, was easy if done with enough conviction. Spending my waitress wages? She added, patting her denim backpack and producing her toothpaste smile, designed to stop all living creatures in their tracks, especially men. Ah, yes, well done. Serena and all of us were most grateful, and to your grandfather, too, of course, for all his sterling work with the car parking and so on. Is he here? Jessica shook her head, her glossy black ponytail swinging. He's having an early night. Gets a bit tired these days, says Grandad. Of course, he does. Well, thanks again. We'll be over there if you need us, Charlie added gallantly, indicating an empty table. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. And Mr. Harrison. Jessica grinned with studied innocence, offering them another little wave. There's something about that girl, murmured Peter, once they were seated out of earshot with their pints. You mean she's bloody cheeky? Yes, and something else, I don't know, Peter frowned. She's so young, but something about her seems very old. Really? Can't say I'd noticed. Ed's keen on her, but then he's at the age where he'd be keen on a chair if it was decked in a short enough skirt. Remember those days? Christ. Charlie threw back his head and laughed, testosterone raging. I wouldn't go back to all of that for anything, would you? Certainly not. Peter smiled, feeling a little superior but trying not to show it. Until Serena, his brother-in-law's love life had been messy and exuberant. He, in contrast, had had only one long relationship before Helen, whom he had recognised at once as someone attractive and intelligent enough to be his ideal partner for the long haul. From the first, he'd been proud of how independent and career-oriented she was, quite the opposite of Serena, who'd made it no secret that her ambitions did not stretch beyond motherhood. Helen was hard-working too, which Peter liked, and had a passion that matched his for the detail and idiosyncrasies of English law. Talking of which, how's Theo getting on? Charlie chuckled. Finding time to enjoy himself, I hope. Peter, swelling visibly with fatherly pride, was about to deliver an account of the sporting and academic prowess of his eldest, when they both noticed Jessica sauntering over to their table, swinging her denim bag. Excuse me, sorry to be a bother and all that, but you said if I needed anything? We did, Charlie assured her, avoiding the stern look in Peter's eye. It's just that I've got to catch a train back to London and I've just phoned and the last one leaves in 15 minutes and I won't get there if I walk and I've really got to catch it as I have this job in a salon at the Arndale on a Saturday. Do you indeed? Right, in that case. Would you like us to call you a taxi? Suggested Peter, reluctant to abandon his pint and the conversation, which hadn't even begun to steer in any of the directions he had planned. I've tried that, Jessica fiddled with her thick tail of hair, momentarily uncertain. But there's only 2 that work in Burham, and they're both booked up. I see. Charlie glanced at his empty glass, then at Peter's, which was still half full. I say, Peter, perhaps? Of course. Peter stood up. I'll run you over there. Thank you so much, Mr. Harrison. No problem. And I'll keep your beer warm, Charlie promised, as the pair left the pub. Outside, Ed, hovering behind a large wooden tub of tight-budded rhododendrons, leapt back as his uncle, the cause of his wait in the cold car park, strode out through the door. He had heard enough of the conversation together that Jessica had wangled a lift to the station and pressed himself against the stone wall, murmuring curses. He'd been well in there, well in. Peering through the foliage and glimpsing Jessica's pale, bare legs, splendid beneath the frayed hem of her miniskirt as she clambered into the car, he groaned. Ed smoked another cigarette as consolation, dropped the stub into the flower tub, then popped a stick of gum into his mouth and retrieved his bicycle from under the hedge where he'd hidden it half an hour before. He pedalled slowly down the lane towards Ashley House, distracted by keen disappointment and a dim disquiet that on a day when he should have been contemplating the demise of his great-aunt, he had allowed himself to be so preoccupied by less edifying matters. He always wanted sex, of course, what 17-year-old virgin male didn't. But today it had been particularly bad. All through the service, the hymns, the prayers for the departed, he'd been able to think of little else, which made him feel sort of guilty but also annoyed. It wasn't like he was religious or anything, and watching someone being buried was bound to make one think of a pleasant alternative, wasn't it? Halfway down the lane, far from the lights of the pub, but not yet within sight of home, Ed became aware of how dark and cold it was. On the outward journey, he'd been too distracted to notice, too excited, his groin aching at the recollection of Jessica's tongue in his ear and her promises during their few snatched moments among the guest coats upstairs. Now, however, with the trees crowding overhead, blocking out the meagre light coming from the fingernail of moon, the darkness seemed as thick as tar. A creature scuttling in the undergrowth to his left made him start. Thinking that only an idiot would be scared of a familiar country lane, and of how the man from the Royal Marines would laugh, Ed began nonetheless to pedal faster, no longer bothering to steer round the numerous potholes and puddles pitting the way. Soon he was blinking sweat from his eyes, trying to fix his gaze on the spot where he imagined the bend in the lane to be, fearing that when he reached it, he would not find the illuminated squares of Ashley House's numerous latticed windows, but yet more darkness. "Did you have a nice time?" called Serena when she heard the front door. "Yep." Ed, the panic still upon him, hovered in the doorway of the television room where his mother was lying on the sofa, with one eye on a book and the other on the screen. She had her new glasses on, half-moon ones that made her look like an old lady, but not old because her hair was still silky soft and mostly brown, and her skin like smooth soap. "Give us a hug then," she said, patting the sofa. Ed hung on by the door, the fear instantly gone, and the desire for sex too, with Jessica or anybody else. He longed to nestle up to his mother, but hesitated, aware of the unused Durex in his back pocket. "Just going to the loo," he called, racing up the stairs 2 at a time and sprinting along the top landing to his bedroom, which was nicely away from everyone and the far end of the corridor with its own bathroom alongside. It took a few seconds to clamber onto a chair and return the Durex to the secret bag he kept on the dusty top of his wardrobe. Then he smeared toothpaste round his teeth, washed his hands and raced back to the television room. "What are you watching?" he asked, a little breathless as he flopped onto the sofa. "It's something telling us what to do in a nuclear crisis. Buy tins of baked beans, hide in a cellar if you've got one, that sort of thing." "Oh," Ed scratched his head. "Well, we've got a cellar anyway." Serena laughed. "Yes, that's smelly and damp and so full of your uncle's wine that we could hardly fit ourselves down there, let alone food supplies and blankets." "There's that new reality show on the other side," ventured Ed. "Can we watch that instead?" Serena yawned. "I suppose so. I'm too tired to care. Ugh, imagine cameras watching us all the time," she added cheerfully, once Ed had switched channels and the show's contestants had appeared, slouching on beanbags and drinking beer. "Imagine everybody knowing what you were up to 24 hours a day, all the little things you keep hidden. Would you like that?" Ed paused, console in hand, alerted by something in her voice, a certain knowingness that made his stomach twist. Was it possible that she knew all about the pub and not working, and Jessica, and the dusty box on top of the wardrobe where he kept dirty magazines? On screen, one of the contestants had pulled out a dildo and was dipping it into her mug of beer. "Actually," he muttered, "that nuclear shelter thing did look quite interesting." He hastily switched channels again and dropped his head onto her shoulder. "That's better." Serena tucked an arm around him and kissed the crown of his head, smelling smoke but not saying anything because, these days, such moments of maternal physical closeness were rare, and she missed them. Side by side on their own much smaller sofa some 10 miles away, Roland and Elizabeth were also watching television, the remains of their supper on plates at their feet. Through the gap in the curtains, which had been designed for their old sitting room in Guildford and didn't close properly, a stream of car headlights flashed past, as regular almost as the ticking of the second-hand clock above the fireplace. "All right, sweetheart." I always think the only good thing about a funeral is the hymns. Roland nodded. She was trying to be jolly, he knew, talking for the sake of it so he wouldn't guess how miserable she was. After the funeral, she'd gone straight upstairs to the phone in her bedroom and closed the door. There had been quiet talking, then a bit of louder stuff and some crying. Roland, making a pot of tea, had tried not to listen, but it was hard with the bedroom being right above the kitchen and the walls of the cottage so thin. A little later, she'd come downstairs with a red nose and puffy eyes, full of questions about what homework he had for the weekend and whether he thought it too early for her to start preparing supper. Roland had played along for a bit, then said, "Was that Richard?" Whereupon his mother had burst into tears and hugged him hard and said yes, but it didn't matter because he'd been a shit and she was well rid of him and what she needed was a strong drink. When Roland said he'd made tea, she patted the pot and squatted down to pull out a bottle from the wine rack set between the two cupboards underneath. 8 slots for 8 bottles, filled and emptied over the course of each week with exactly the regularity as the slots for the eggs in the fridge door and the jars of pasta ranged above them. Roland had handed her the corkscrew, then carefully stirred 2 heaped sugars into his mug and retreated into the sitting room. He wouldn't miss Richard, he decided, casting a look at his mother, who kicked off her heavy shoes and was resting her stockinged feet on the chair next to the sofa. There was a small ladder in one, showing the yellow ridges of her big toenail. Richard, in Roland's opinion, had been noisy and unreadable from the start, the sort of man who repeated jokes and still expected you to laugh, ignoring Roland one minute, then asking him impossible questions the next. He had an ex-wife whom he called the old cow, and an open-topped sports car that was always breaking down. His job was something boring-sounding to do with the Arts Council, though he talked about it as if he was running the country. His breath smelt, too, sometimes so badly that Roland had wondered how his mother could bear to be anywhere near the man, let alone press her lips to the scratchy thicket of his beard. "What about a biscuit or two? There are some of those nice chocolate ones, I think. Would you like one?" "Not really, but I'll get them if you want." "I shouldn't." She patted the swell of her stomach dolefully. "I'm far too fat already." "No, you're not," Roland replied, partly out of duty, but mostly because he never thought of his mother as fat or thin. She just was, and he couldn't imagine her otherwise. He fetched the biscuits, and she ate 2, very quickly. "Did you see this?" she said when she'd finished, waving Cassie and Stephen's invitation. "As it's a Saturday, I thought we could make a day of it, go to an exhibition or something beforehand." Roland was loath, after the tedium of the afternoon, to commit himself to another adult party, but did not want to ruin all the effort she was making to be cheerful. "She is your godmother?" his mother prompted. "Yeah, I know." They were silent for a few minutes until Elizabeth, still studying the invitation, let out a long sigh. "Funerals and weddings. Sometimes I wonder why we bother." "Look, I'll come to Aunt Cassie's party, okay?" said Roland fiercely, detecting the glum turn the conversation was taking and wanting to put a stop to it. Any moment, and she'd be talking about how Little Boots, the Labrador puppy they'd got while they were living with his grandparents, had managed to get sick and die from some rare fluke of a liver disease. How bad luck never let her go. After a glass or two, the poor little animal often made an appearance in her long list of life's blows. "Oh, will you? Thank you, darling." Elizabeth's expression had switched in an instant from slack despondency to watery-eyed joy. "Do you realise it will be you lot next, my sweet? Maisie, Clem, Theo, you, the next generation, getting married, starting families. Oh, my goodness, I shall enjoy that, becoming a grandmother. Oh, my goodness, yes." Elizabeth laughed, a rich, natural laugh, like she was looking through a window at a better world. Roland stood up, in a hurry suddenly to be alone in his room with the zoning-out solace of some music and one of his art books. It happened like that sometimes, like suddenly he couldn't bear to be near her a moment longer, not because he didn't love her, but because he understood her so well that the pressure was simply too much. "Going upstairs." He stuffed his hands into his jeans pockets and sauntered out of the room, forcing himself not to break into a run when he reached the steep little staircase connecting the ground floor to the 2 bedrooms and bathroom above. There was an attic, too, a lovely, huge space, which he peered at longingly sometimes from the top of the pull-out ladder that led up to it. One day it would be his mother had promised, when she had enough money for a conversion, which, with his dad in America and not sending checks anymore, would probably be never, Roland reflected, casting a wistful glance up at the trapdoor in the ceiling before he slipped into his bedroom. Downstairs, Elizabeth tipped the last inch of wine into her glass and reached for the biscuit packet. She ate several more in quick succession, doing her best to concentrate on their sugary sweetness instead of the sourness of her own self-loathing. By the time Charlie and Peter got back from the rising sun, Serena and Ed had retired upstairs to bed. The 2 brothers were greeted in Ashley House's wide oak-panelled hall by Poppy, who leapt gleefully from her bed in the kitchen at the sound of the car and trotted along the passage, dragging her blanket with her by way of a welcome. She yelped with particular pleasure at the sight of Charlie, burying her nose and blanket into the back of his knees for attention. "Shush, you daft dog," he scolded, tugging her silky ears. "You'll wake the household." That's what Dad always used to call Boots. Do you remember? "What? Daft, you daft animal," he'd say. Did he? Charlie frowned. "I don't remember. I remember many things, but not that." He cast a look at Peter as they eased off their coats. The pub had been good, but not quite right somehow. Picking up his beer after dropping Jessica at the station, his brother had launched into an unwelcome and unexpected diatribe on the upkeep of Ashley House, as if he'd been secretly scrutinizing the place with a magnifying glass. Charlie did his best not to take offence, but had been offended nonetheless. It had taken all his natural affability to ride out the discussion without losing his temper, and such a far cry from the easy exchange of news and views he'd been hoping for, that he was determined now to set things right. "A nightcap? Excellent idea. A malt, please, and a few leftovers if there are any. Those pub sandwiches were disgusting." "Coming right up." Charlie headed for the kitchen, closely followed by the dog. Re-entering the television room a few minutes later, carrying a tray of drinks and food, he found Peter sitting squarely in the large leather armchair, so often frequented by their father that the smell of his pipe was still faintly detectable in its beaten leather folds. Ah, good man," growled Peter. "That's exactly what I need." "Cheers." Charlie stretched out on the sofa, balancing his own drink and a heaped plate of leftover canapes on his stomach. It was weird, he mused, seeing his brother in the old man's chair. Looking so like him, yet not, because Peter was a lot leaner, with a longer nose and small, delicate ears, instead of their father's big jug handles with their heavy lobes. Weird, but nice, Charlie decided, raising his glass, feeling pleasantly, mildly drunk. "To Aunt Alicia and all who sailed in her. To Cassandra and Stephen, to the future. Talking of which, Serena and I were thinking of changing the layout of this room a bit. Knocking down that wall there, left of the door, easing access to the kitchen, useful for TV dinners and so on. And also, upstairs, we thought we might convert the green dressing room into an ensuite to take the pressure off the top-floor bathroom. And then there's the old tool shed, which I'm planning to turn into a proper sort of studio for Serena." Charlie faltered, discouraged by the expression on Peter's face. "Improvements, as you were suggesting in the pub." "What I was suggesting in the pub?" Peter felt for the signet ring on the little finger of his left hand and twisted it so that the face was next to his knuckle. "What I was suggesting," he pressed on, soothed as always by this small correction to the ring, which had belonged to his father and was seal engraved with the family crest, was merely the replacing of a few missing roof tiles, regrouting the front wall, getting those weeds out before they crack the patio to smithereens, and maybe setting that weather vane on an even keel before it topples off in the next high wind and kills somebody. Oh. Not, as I said earlier, that I want to interfere or criticize. No. Charlie eased himself to a more upright position and stared hard at the patterns crisscrossing the sides of his crystal whiskey tumbler. But that's what you're doing, isn't it? His usually jovial face was struggling not to show the extent of his dismay. No, it isn't, insisted Peter quietly. I love this place. I can't help wanting it to be looked after, that's all. And it is looked after and always shall be. Charlie drained his glass. Okay. Peter swirled the remaining swig of his own whiskey, telling himself not to be surprised at Charlie's resistance, but feeling suddenly as if they were perched on a tightrope, unbalancing each other in their respective efforts not to fall off. And as for the other, more extensive alterations you mentioned, go easy, wouldn't you? Too much change might upset Mum. Upset Mum or upset you? Don't be ridiculous. Each custodian of this house has made his mark. I fully support your right to do as you wish, within reason. Peter looked up to meet the gaze of his brother's blue eyes, which seemed both bold and terrified. It's your house now, and I'm delighted it is. I hand over the reins freely and stand by that gift. Slowly, Charlie let out his breath. Good. Thank you. That's good to hear. The plans are still just vague ideas, he added carefully, and would probably cost far too much to carry out anyway. I'm a civil servant, remember? He pulled a comic face, wanting to puncture the bubble of tension that was now in danger of ruining the evening. A civil servant who, very happily I might add, settled for bricks and mortar instead of cash, he added, suppressing the usual stab of guilt at the fact that what his siblings had received in liquid assets was still nothing in comparison to the value of the house. I'm so glad that when Mum goes, whatever remains in the bank will be for you, Lizzie and Cassie, he added hastily in a bid to see off the guilt. Please always know how grateful I am, Peter, for what you did. No need, Peter muttered. It was the right thing for everyone. And I'll deal with all the things you mentioned, I promise, Charlie went on eagerly. You were right to point them out. The truth is, Sid isn't up to keeping on top of repairs anymore. Serena and I are thinking about a replacement, but it's hard, with the old man's pride to consider, and all the hard work he's put in over the decades. But we're on it, okay? Now, let's drink some more scotch and stop behaving like grumpy old men. Peter grunted agreement and reached for the whiskey bottle. He filled Charlie's glass before his own, tipping it slowly and carefully, then adding water from the jug Charlie had brought from the kitchen. I'm the grumpy old man, he muttered, placing one hand briefly on his younger brother's shoulder. Ask Helen. I'm always biting her head off. Don't know how she puts up with it. Nor do I, joked Charlie. The hand on his shoulder meant everything. Peter was good like that. A dragon at 1 minute, then so conciliatory and understanding the next that you had to forgive him. By the way, said Peter, after a few moments of a now thoroughly companionable silence, how does Umbria in August sound? Umbria in August? Charlie laughed. It was Helen's idea. She's found this spectacular farmhouse-cum-villa in the hills outside Todi. Where's that? Near Orvieto. Well, not far anyway. Anyway, it's got 7 bedrooms, a massive swimming pool, hot and cold running maids, that sort of thing. We thought it might be fun to get the whole family out there, move Ashley House to Italy, so to speak. In fact, we've already shelled out a deposit. Places like that you have to move quickly. Who's moving Ashley House? Said Serena, appearing in the doorway in a pair of soft blue pyjamas, hair tousled, her face pale with sleepiness. Charlie swiveled into a sitting position and reached out a hand to draw her to the sofa. Sweetheart, did we wake you? No, Serena assured him, yawning as she clambered onto the sofa and tucked her legs under her chin. It was your mother. I heard her walking around her room then, just as I was about to go in, it all went quiet again. Then I heard an owl hooting and Poppy barked. Then I heard you. She yawned again. Poor baby, Charlie whispered, reaching out and stroking her hair. Serena smiled and closed her eyes, tipping her head towards his hand. Watching them, Peter felt a shiver of something between admiration and envy. Not of Serena, whose beauty, while obvious, had never stirred anything but the purest appreciation, but for the way they were together, the effortless intimacy of their partnership. In many ways, they were an old-fashioned couple, Charlie earning the money, calling the shots, but it worked, by God it worked. Helen's hair, thicker and shorter, more bristly than Serena's, didn't lend itself to stroking, but even if it had flowed like silk to her waistline, Peter, in all of the 25-odd years they'd been together, would never have touched it in that way, at such a public moment, with such protective tenderness. He and Helen were tender when they made love, of course, more so if anything, as the years trickled by. But outside the bedroom, they'd always been businesslike, running their hectic lives like a well-oiled machine. Peter and Helen have booked a luxury Italian farmhouse for us all to go to in the summer, Charlie explained. Have they? What heaven! Umbria, big enough for the whole family. Including your mother? Certainly, replied Peter firmly. I know she's not keen on flying, but it would do her so much good, don't you think? Her first proper break without Dad. I'll tie her to the plane if necessary. Now that I would like to see, said Charlie, as he heaved himself off the sofa, pulling Serena gently with him. Come on, my petal, it's way past our bedtime. I'll follow shortly, Peter told them, pointing at his glass, in which half an inch of whiskey remained, but really just wanting to stay a little longer in the deep armchair with the quiet tick of the old house around him and the wind rattling the windows like an excluded guest. It was almost 11 o'clock by the time Jessica tottered along the platform towards the station exit, high heels clacking on the concrete. She'd fallen asleep on the train and woken just before her stop to find a bloke with bushy hair staring at her with the look men had when they were interested. She'd given him her best fuck-off stare and crossed her legs so that he couldn't ogle up her skirt. He got off in front of her and was striding up the platform now, the only other person in sight, shoulders hunched under a dirty green anorak. Jessica slowed a little so there was no chance of catching up and checked her phone for messages. Ed would have turned his off by now, she knew, but she punched in, "See you soon, Jay, kiss." Then tried her mum and got no answer. At the flats, the lifts weren't working, though few people were dumb enough to risk them at night anyway, what with all the nutters who used them when they were off their heads or needing a piss. Jessica took off her shoes to climb the stairs, partly so that none of the estate's losers could hear her coming, and partly because her toes, squashed into the tight, pointy plastic all day, were killing her. At the door of the flat, she rummaged in her bag for her keys, keeping a wary eye on the dank hallway that stretched on either side. From inside, she could hear the sound of the television and guessed her mum would be asleep on the settee in front of it, her ciggies and an empty can on the floor next to her. "Where have you been, then?" said Maureen, the moment the door opened, not asleep, but leaning against the kitchen door, like she spent all night waiting up. "Nice to see you too." Jessica tossed her shoes and bag onto the floor and pushed past her into the kitchen. "Anything to eat?" "Haven't you had any dinner?" "I wouldn't want anything to eat if I had, would I?" "Where have you been then, love?" asked Maureen in a softer voice, putting a fresh cigarette into her mouth and watching as her daughter moved around the coop of a kitchen, fixing herself a sandwich. "I stayed on a bit with Grandad." "Oh, yes, and how was he?" inquired Maureen, green eyes narrowing with suspicion. "I had a cup of tea. It's fine. Then I went to the Rising Sun and had a couple of drinks." "Very nice. And that Harrison boy was there, I expect, was he?" "Might have been." "You're wasting your time, girl. Having a grandfather who's their gardener and playing waitress at their fancy funerals doesn't get you into their world, you know. He's pissing around with you, that's all. Like you would know, wouldn't you?" "I know a bloody sight more than you, young lady," snapped Maureen, tapping ash into a saucer. "Fat lot of good it's done you." Jessica pressed the two halves of her sandwich together and bit into it, keeping her eyes, which were as green as Maureen's but brighter and more hostile, fixed on her mother. Such skirmishes were part of their daily routine, how they talked to each other. Once they'd upset her, but now at 16, with the end of her school days and a bit of independence in sight, Jessica had got better at not caring. Her mum's life, by her own moaning admission, had been a mess. Men who'd run off, including Jessica's father, jobs in pub kitchens and cleaning people's houses, offloading Jessica to long-suffering neighbours, or, when she really couldn't cope, at Grandad's in Barham. It had always been a case of holding things together, making do, railing at disappointment. Jessica had seen enough of it, felt too much a part of it to want anything like that for herself. I would have stayed over. Grandad said I could, but I've got to be at the salon for 9:30. Oh yeah, this job of yours. Maureen inhaled deeply on her cigarette and folded her arms. How much did you say you're getting? I didn't. Jessica took a bite of sandwich, letting half of it splurge out on purpose so that she looked gross. None of your bloody business. Come on, Jess, don't be like that. Maureen dropped her cigarette into the saucer and advanced upon her daughter with open arms. Be nice to your old mum, darling. I do love you, you know. Yeah, whatever. Holding her sandwich out of the way, Jessica allowed herself to be embraced. She even let herself relax a little, taking in the familiar smoky scent and thinking that a hug was nice, even if it was the whiff of extra cash that had prompted it. 30 quid plus tips, Jerry said. Jerry, you want to watch him and all? I can look after myself, replied her daughter archly, pushing Maureen away and going into their little lounge to finish her sandwich in front of the television. She ate slowly, leaving the crusts, which were brittle, on the arm of her chair, positioning them in a little line across all the ring stains left by years of too full, too hot mugs of cuppa soup, coffee and tea. Her mum telling her to watch out for Jerry was a laugh. How did she think she got the job in the first place? Saturday work was hard to find, especially with girls like Shona and Aileen trawling the same possibilities, with their pushy mums to back them up. Jessica had used her own wiles, not letting him go all the way, but undoing his jeans and giving him what he wanted with her hand. It never took long with men like him, full of flirt but worried all the time that someone might come in or the wife might get on the phone. You can work here for as long as you want, darling, he'd grunted afterwards when she was wiping her hands. So long as we can have a cuddle now and then. He'd kissed her and patted her ass, then strolled back into the salon. And when Jessica had bumped into Shona and Aileen in the precinct later that day, she'd held her head high and asked how was their job hunting going. Chapter 2. March. Stephen hovered in the doorway, avoiding eye contact with his guests as he scanned the packed sitting room for Cassie. It was a few moments before he spotted her, in the corner by the bookcase, deep in conversation with Charlie, always the most convivial of her 3 siblings. She was laughing at something, throwing back her cloud of blonde hair and opening her mouth wide, every sinew of her face and body alert with pleasure and interest. At 42, she was still beautiful, alive with energy, so open and giving, so impossible not to love. Watching her, Stephen experienced a fierce urge to elbow his way through the throng and lay claim to her, to kiss her laughing mouth, taste the joy of whatever she was sharing with her brother. He stared hard, willing her to turn her head, fighting a momentary, unedifying prickle of envy. Sibling, friend, or stranger, the world engaged her so. She was lost in conversation with Charlie, just as she lost herself in anything she did. Advising clients on colour schemes for their homes, reading a book, watching telly. She managed to fall asleep the instant she put her mind to it. In contrast, Stephen had spent many of his 37 years struggling with the sense that he was standing, arms akimbo, watching an irreversible video of his life. Even at his desk, on the rare occasions that his fingers flew over the keys, steering his Irish detective through another intricate case of murder and skeletons in cupboards, half his mind remained not just obstinately unabsorbed, but separate and critical of his endeavours. The week since Cassie's aunt's funeral had been dominated by preparations for their party. Rushing to finish the decorating, haggling with the local deli over revised estimates for the food and drink. Stephen had wondered many times whether it would prove worth the effort. Only Cassie's infectious enthusiasm had kept him going. "We've so much to celebrate," she had reminded him just the night before as they lay side by side on the sitting room floor, nursing headaches from the petrol smell of fresh gloss paint and surrounded by yards of the sticky masking tape that had protected their new bottle green carpet from stray dribbles from the skirting boards. "Let's see now." She had held up her fingers and begun, literally, to count their blessings. "Your contract, me managing to buy us this lovely little house, and, I'm sure there was something else." Stephen had rolled across the carpet and pulled her into his arms so eagerly that a nest of tape caught in her hair. "Ow, bugger!" "Hang on, stop pulling, you're making it worse. Don't move." He had sat up and held her head still to inspect the damage, trying to appear serious but thinking how dear she looked with the tape in her hair and such a furious expression. "Now, don't move." He'd fetched some scissors and then set about teasing free each strand, doing his best not to hurt her. He had worked slowly, sucking his lower lip in concentration, aware of her mounting irritation and the faint sensation of pleasure in having her at his mercy. "There, all done." Cassie had rubbed her scalp. "Are you sure there isn't a bald patch?" "Well, only a small one." "Where?" she'd squealed, before catching sight of his face. "Oh, Stephen, how mean. It's too late for teasing, I'm tired." She'd lunged for a newspaper and flung it at him, catching his shoulder. Stephen had thrown it back far more vigorously, scattering pages, which flew briefly like drunken birds, before subsiding across the furniture. Then, because she was starting to smile, he lobbed over a sofa cushion as well, one of the old ones, which landed square on her chest, releasing a cloudburst of feathers. Moments later, they were wrestling, then tugging frantically at the zips and buttons of each other's clothes. They had eventually toppled into the biggest armchair, where they made ungainly love, as feverishly enthusiastic as they had been the first time, 3 years before, when the passion Stephen had nursed for so long had been rewarded by an explosion of reciprocity. Now Stephen glanced at that armchair and saw that Cassie's square-jawed barrister of an elder brother, Peter, occupied it, looking grave and a little too self-important. Stephen couldn't help laughing. Their lovemaking had left a wet patch, he remembered gleefully, right in the middle of the cushion. Cassie had scrubbed at it with washing-up liquid and a cloth while he finished peeling the masking tape off the carpet. "What's the joke, then?" Stephen spun round, caught off guard by the familiar voice of his old friend, Keith Holmes, whom he hadn't seen arrive. There's no joke, at least not one I'm prepared to share." He laughed awkwardly, blushing, feeling as wrong-footed as he had when Keith had erupted with delighted expletives out of a small book-signing queue a couple of months before. "Really glad you can make it tonight," Stephen added, still with enough stiffness to cause a trace of something like pain to flash across Keith's rugged face. A beaten-up face these days, Stephen thought, as if the man had spent 2 decades in a boxing ring or fronting a rugby scrum. "Still can't believe it, eh? After all these years?" "No, I guess not." Stephen blew out his cheeks, shaking his head. "Our days at Kelsey Secondary seem a long way away." "Thank God, what a dive, eh?" Keith grinned, producing a more familiar version of his features. The lips a little lopsided, the dark eyes flashing with charm. "Stephen Smith, a thriller writer. I tell you, mate, I'm still pinching myself." Keith chuckled and reached for his cigarettes, only to recall that he was in a no-smoking zone. He ran the palm of his hand across the top of his head instead, reassured, for no reason he could have defined, by the feel of the short, thick bristles of his crew cut. Looking round at the elegant furnishings and polite wine-sipping guests, he let out a low whistle. "You've done all right, Steve, I'll say that for you. Talk about landing on your feet." "Well, Cassie is an interior designer," Stephen faltered, aware that he was sounding pompous and remembering with sudden distressing vividness the ugly, cramped box rooms and the scrubby back gardens in which he and Keith had played out their mutually unsatisfactory childhoods in the suburbs of Hull. Seeing him in the Camden bookshop, he'd felt a confused surge of pleasure and anxiety. They'd been good friends, the best, but had lost touch when Stephen did a TEFL course and took off to South America, returning 12 years later to forge a new life in London. Keith, from what Stephen had gathered during the course of their drink after the signing, had stayed in Hull, married a local girl, and followed his father into the building trade. He hadn't made the move to London until his early 30s, and within a year of doing so was eking out a living on building sites. His wife had headed back north with their 2 sons. "Cassie's great," Keith remarked, nodding appreciatively as he recalled her firm handshake at the door. On learning who he was, she had promptly kissed him on both cheeks, doing the "any friend of Stephen's is a friend of mine" routine, which was corny but bloody nice all the same. "Classy," he added, casting a sidelong look at Stephen and reappraising the leather-tasselled loafers, the crisp blue chinos and white linen shirt, the manicured nails and floppy Hugh Grant haircut. The Stephen he remembered was a sallow-faced 17-year-old with dark, angry eyes and a gallery of bruises round his torso and thighs, varying in colour according to their age and the degree of severity with which his old man had chosen to swing the belt. His hair had been long and greasy then, often held back in a ponytail or shoved up under a cap, particularly when they were skiving off school at the bus station or in shopping malls, trying not to look like truants. Spotting Stephen's picture in the bookshop window, the groomed appearance, the enigmatic smile, had been like having 2 realities running side by side. Then, when they got to talking afterwards, the 2 pictures had merged, and Keith had felt this shout of joy inside, not just for Stephen, but for himself, like the revival of hope. "How did you 2 get together then, you and such a classy bird?" Stephen hesitated, wanting to do justice to the extraordinary business of meeting Cassie Harrison and the certain knowledge that such a task would be impossible. Explaining love at first sight was a tough call at the best of times, let alone to someone with whom he felt so out of touch, who was clearly down on his luck and who Stephen couldn't help wishing had stayed in the box of the past to which he had hitherto confined him. Though he was on Christmas card terms with his parents these days, cutting loose from the first 18 years of his life had been as fundamental and deliberate as a snake shedding a dead skin. "I was doing some research on Cassie's uncle for a book, my first," he said at length. "It was about unrecognised heroes of the Second World War. I went to interview Cassie's parents about him at their place in Sussex." Stephen paused as an image of Ashley House shimmered in his mind, with its frothing ivied walls and chimney stacks rising like periscopes out of the angled sea of its grey slate roof. "And, well, Cassie was there too. I ended up staying for supper. We played Scrabble and—" "Scrabble!" Stephen, hearing the sneer in his tone, looked away quickly, cursing himself for even beginning to attempt to lead his friend onto such hallowed ground. How could Keith or anyone else understand what had happened to him that day? A bachelor and a cynic, he had fallen in love so instantly and deeply that even now, 6 years on, he trembled to remember it. A long period of mad pursuit had followed, while Cassie had remained indifferent, going through her own private tortures over a married doctor who had promised to leave his wife but never quite managed it. "Scrabble," Keith repeated with an irreverent guffaw, thinking for no good reason of Stephen's sister, Claire, whom he'd screwed once, really quickly, standing up in the little alleyway that ran alongside their house, leaning against the cold wall for support. She'd never given him a second glance after that, though personally Keith would have been happy to keep the thing going. She was in Canada now, Stephen had said, with teenaged kids and a husband who spoke French. Stephen was searching for a way to change the subject when Elizabeth, frumpy in spite of a glittering black dress and crimson lipstick, bounced up to him. "This house is so lovely, Stephen. I've been having a snoop upstairs. I hope you don't mind." "Not at all. This is Keith Holmes, a very old friend from my dim and distant youth. Keith, this is Elizabeth, Cassie's elder sister. She lives in Sussex too, very near Cassie's mother. And now, if you'll excuse me." Stephen edged away. Cassie chose that moment to catch his eye. She smiled and the rest of the room melted away. Stephen mouthed, "I love you," and held up 10 fingers, silently pronouncing the words, 10 months to go. He had to do it twice before she laughed in happy recognition, mouthing, "I love you too," as she manoeuvred her way to Pamela, who was sitting alone on a high-backed chair, staring about her with the air of a bemused child. "Your mother doesn't seem too good," whispered Helen, perching on the arm of Peter's chair. She touched her husband's shoulder briefly, wondering whether to inquire after the back muscles he'd strained exercising the day before. Since his aunt's funeral, maybe even because of it, Helen mused, he seemed to have cranked up his fitness regime to a new level. If he didn't get to the gym from Chambers, he'd taken to punishing himself for an hour in the evening, alternating between the bike and the rowing machine now installed in the games room of their new extension. Definitely worse than at the funeral. "You think so? I think she looks not too bad." Peter glanced across the room, relieved to see that Charlie was taking his turn at Pamela's side. In fact, she's done bloody well to come. Managing these things without Dad must still be hard for her. He ran his hand across his forehead, briefly fingering his eyebrows. So wiry and wild these days, and the contrastingly smooth, small circle of his bald patch. As one got older, hair grew in all the least desired places, he was discovering, while simultaneously absenting itself from where it was most needed. "Will you go soft in the head when I'm gone?" he asked after a pause, making a ghoulish face. Helen chuckled. "I hope not. What a horrible thought. And anyway, who says you'll be first? Also, I didn't mean to suggest for a moment that your mother is losing her wits." She hesitated, twisting her rope of pearls round her index finger as she pondered her mother-in-law, whom she'd always found tricky. One of those quiet but immensely strong characters who dominated a room or an atmosphere by saying nothing at all. It's just that she sort of floats sometimes, and, well, she is repeating herself a little more, isn't she? She must have asked after Genevieve at least 3 times tonight. Peter flexed his shoulders, grimacing at the knots of resistance that had taken root inside. "Yes, but at 79 a little absent-mindedness should be perfectly allowable," he muttered, feeling as if he was defending something beyond the mental agility of his mother. "For years, your dear parents couldn't find a butter dish without each other's help. And of course, she's going to ask a lot about Genevieve because she adores Genevieve, and having lost one little granddaughter, she probably wishes she saw more of this one. And talking of Genevieve," Helen said pointedly, tapping a fingernail on the face of her wristwatch. She was in no mood to have her spirits dampened by references to the tragedy of their niece, nor did she want Peter to tell her for the umpteenth time that they didn't spend enough weekends with his family in the country. Ashley House was lovely, of course, rather like a grand hotel. But Genevieve was just as happy playing with her little friends in their own substantial home and garden in Barnes, while Chloe had netball matches, parties, and increasing piles of homework to get through. More crucially, she'd noticed that Peter often returned from the place in a fractious mood. After his funeral stopover, he'd been positively stormy. From a hangover, he'd claimed. But Helen suspected that something more was going on. Some fracas with Charlie, who was a dear, but could also be maddeningly bumbling and indecisive. Probing had got her nowhere. The only good result of the visit, as far as she could see, was that her idea about the Umbrian villa had apparently received rapturous approval. She had confirmed the booking just that morning, emailing credit card details and contact phone numbers, then gone to another website to reserve 5 very reasonably priced return tickets to Rome. Afterwards, Helen had felt elated. They'd spent far too many precious summer breaks making do with patchy sunshine and Ashley House's sludgy lake, reserving escapes to warmer climes for snatched weeks in the autumn. The rest of the Harrison clan accompanying them, while not ideal, was an easy price to pay. She was fond of her husband's family and would feel even fonder, she was sure, under blue Italian skies surrounded by olive groves with a swimming pool, not to mention a maid who would shop for essentials, provide fresh towels and wipe wet footprints from the villa's spectacular marble floors. "I told Griselda we'd be back by 11, she said now, her mind leaping from track to track as it always did, as it had to stay on top of things. It wouldn't be fair on either of them if Jenny wakes for any reason. You know what she's like." "Indeed I do, and it's not yet 10, Peter replied, wearily noting his wife's capacity to worry about arrangements to leave a place just minutes after she crossed its threshold. He was weary, too, of the pain firing like electric shocks across his upper back, making hard work of what should have been an enjoyable occasion. But they'd done the long trek from Barnes to Camden, and he was determined not to let the demands of their delightful but exhausting 4-year-old interrupt it prematurely. Helen got off the arm of the chair and impatiently smoothed out the lap of her blue silk dress, which showed off her skinny figure but creased at the slightest ruffling. "And there's Chloe, too. We've got to collect her from her sleepover at 8 tomorrow morning, so a late night wouldn't be a good idea. Really, Helen, stop fussing." "Sorry," she muttered, in such an uncharacteristic and sudden change of tack that he glanced at her in surprise. Helen looked away quickly, fiddling with a clasp on her evening bag, wishing they were leaving for Umbria the next day instead of in 5 months' time. Peter was right. She was always fussing. It was like a reflex she couldn't control. She hadn't always been like that. When she was pregnant with Genevieve, a wonderful tranquility had descended from nowhere, making her feel unworried, powerful, and at peace. Filling her unbidden like some holy grace, it had ebbed away again, leaving her as she was now, as she had been when Theo and Chloe were small, whirling like a dervish between appointments and commitments, dragging anxiety and maternal guilt behind her like a ball and chain. "Hello, you two," cried Cassie, appearing beside them from the throng of guests. "Are you all right over here? Peter, someone said you'd hurt your neck." "It was my shoulder, but it's fine, Cassie, thank you." Peter heaved himself out of his chair with as much agility as he could muster and kissed his younger sister on both cheeks. "Congratulations again. We're so happy for the pair of you, aren't we, Helen?" "Delighted," said Helen smoothly. "Though I gather we've got to wait until January for the happy day." "It's not ideal, is it?" gushed Cassie, too happy with the evening and life in general to mind the dryness of her sister-in-law's tone. "But there's so much to factor in, what with our work commitments, not to mention planning all the details. January, at least, means we have heaps of time to organise it properly. Charlie and Serena are being fantastic, saying Ashley House will be at our disposal. We're looking at marquees already. It turns out you can get special ones for the winter and in all sorts of exotic shapes, too. Stephen's current favourite is like a cross between Tower Bridge and the Taj Mahal." Cassie paused for breath, aware amid her exuberance of a faint temptation to disclose the possibility of another momentous event on the horizon, an event connected to the fact that, as of this morning, her period was officially 3 days overdue. 3 whole days. It had been 1 day late before, 2 once, but never 3. Stephen, still wary of the whole concept of parenthood, insisted it was far too early to make plans. But Cassie couldn't help thinking that if she was pregnant, they might have to rush the wedding and maybe focus a big Ashley House gathering on a christening instead. "So, all in all, it'll be a bit like your 50th, Peter," she continued gaily. "A big tent on the lawn, slap-up food, and probably a jazz band, because Stephen's mad about jazz." "How super," murmured Helen, unmoved by her sister-in-law's girlish enthusiasm. To her, a big white wedding seemed faintly ridiculous for a woman of almost 43, even if it was the first time down the aisle for both parties. There was something theatrical about Peter's younger sister that never failed to annoy her, as if she lived for display rather than substance, perhaps from having spent too many years focusing on wallpapers and carpet swatches, Helen decided, casting a beady look at Cassie but saying sweetly, "How lovely for your mother to have another family wedding to look forward to, and at St. Margaret's too, where she and John married all those years ago." "Oh yes, Mum is pleased." Cassie cast an affectionate glance at the upright figure, perched alone now on a high-backed chair. "I'm so glad she came tonight. I'm so glad all of you came. It means the world to me, and to Stephen, not having a family of his own to speak of, at least not like ours. His sister lives in Canada, and he's on such poor terms with his parents that he says he doesn't want me to meet them before the wedding. He isn't even sure he's going to invite them, which is so sad, don't you think? Mum does seem frail, though, doesn't she? She added, gazing wistfully at Pamela. All I can say is thank God she's got darling Charlie and Serena to look after her. Takes the worry from all of us. Thank God indeed, murmured Helen, reminding herself that without Peter's extraordinarily bold decision to pass the inheritance of the family home to his younger brother, such a fate might have been hers. She wasn't good with frailty. Even when the children were ill, she felt a sort of deep impatience with it all. The sticky plastic spoons, the waiting, the endless uncontrollability of their recovery, perky one minute and floppy the next, just when you got your hopes up. Attempting to look after Pamela would have driven her mad. All the set ways and naps and cups of tea, with no end in sight other than increasing fragility and death. It made her shudder just to think of it. At least with a child's soaring temperature or one of Peter's awful fluey colds, when she often wanted to shake the self-pity out of him as much as the illness, one could hold on to the cheering thought that it was finite. Remembering his strained shoulder suddenly, fearing it might be the start of some lingering malaise, she reached up and rubbed her palm tenderly across his upper back. And as for you, a consultation with a physio might be in order. Peter flinched. Maybe. I know a brilliant one, put in Cassie brightly. Thanks to a job I did. She's not far from you either, in Richmond. She works from home. It's a beautiful house, right on the river. I tell you, decorating the place was pure heaven. Her husband's a corporate lawyer or something, loads of money. She sorted out my clicky ankle, and Stephen's been to her a couple of times for his neck, which seizes up from sitting at his computer all day. I'll give you her number, Peter. Don't let me forget, will you? Now I better circulate. Catch you later. Sometimes I think I preferred your sister when she was single and subdued, muttered Helen darkly. Now, scolded Peter, but with a twinkle in his eye because he knew exactly what she meant. Come on, we'll circulate too for 20 more minutes or so before we get out of here. He began to move, then grimaced, gripping his sore shoulder. I'll get that number off Cassie, said Helen, alarmed at the pain on her husband's face. He was 55 after all, she reminded herself, just 3 years older than her. People might well boast that 50 was the new 40, but it was meaningless if one didn't hang on to one's health. Sitting on her chair with her handbag on her lap, Pamela kept her eyes down. Everybody, she felt, was watching her. She was watching herself. It was hateful. Made her feel unsafe, on constant red alert for a slip of memory, tongue, or some part of her digestive system. Everything was worse if you worried about it, she knew, but it was impossible not to worry, especially being away from Ashley House in a place where nothing was familiar. Just the thrum of the London traffic in the car that evening with Charlie and Serena, the sirens, the car radios, the rumble of buses, had made her draw away from the window, reluctant even to peer out at such an imposing alien world. And then, arriving at the party, she'd been bursting for the loo, as she'd known she would be, even though she'd restricted herself to 1 cup of tea all afternoon. It was ridiculous, and all down to worry, of course, much more to do with her head than her waterworks. But what good was it to know that when the worry wouldn't stop and the ache in her bladder was as keen as a twisting knife? Cassie, dear, I need to go to the bathroom, she had whispered, as soon as they were in the hall and being offered drinks. But you must use the nice upstairs one, her daughter had insisted kindly, delivering hasty instructions about turning right and then left when she reached the landing, before leaping off to let in more guests. Arriving at the top of the stairs a little out of breath, Pamela had stared about her blankly, all the door instructions forgotten. She had tried various handles, tentatively at first, and then with real urgency as the ache in her bladder grew unspeakable and a dreadful sensation of clammy wetness seeped into her pants. Stumbling at last through the main bedroom and into its handsome ensuite, she had closed the door only to find there was no lock. Precious more seconds were wasted while Pamela absorbed this unsettling fact. pitting her mounting desperation against visions of her soon-to-be son-in-law barging in on her, eradicating every remaining shred of her already crumbling dignity. Desperation had won in the end, but the fear of Stephen opening the door had never left, rushing her unpleasantly as she relieved and cleaned herself up as best she could. Afterwards, looking at her reflection in their mirrored wall above the basin, Pamela had held up her hands and watched them tremble. "Hopeless old woman," she had scolded, digging courage from her anger and balling her hands into fists. "Stop being such a fool." She'd felt better after that, even humming a little as she powdered the shine from her forehead and filled the thinning line of her mouth with lipstick. Walking back through the bedroom, she was able to take more notice of her surroundings. The forget-me-not blue curtains, the pretty trellises of flowers on the wallpaper, the long soft pile of the new cream carpet, the creaseless white duvet and pillows as plump as ripe fruit. Like the proverbial clean sheet, Pamela had thought wistfully, pressing a dimple into the duvet with one fingertip and remembering all the wonder of new love and the rich, complicated map of marriage that followed. Finding her way back to the landing, she almost bumped into Roland. "Hello, darling, are you looking for the loo?" "No, Gran," her grandson explained in a breathy rush, blushing. "Stephen said if I was bored I could come up to his study and play on his computer. He's got loads of games, apparently. Says he prefers them to writing his books." Roland glanced over the banisters, aware that if his mother saw him he'd be hauled back downstairs. "Is Ed here too?" Pamela had peered over his shoulder as if half expecting his cousin to pop up out of nowhere. "I think Ed stayed at Ashley House, didn't he, Granny, to do some revision for his A-levels?" "Of course he did. How silly of me to forget. I say, darling, would you mind giving me a little hand down the stairs? I'm feeling just the slightest bit dizzy and would so hate to fall and cause a fuss." Roland had led her to the high-backed chair and then raced back upstairs. Pamela had stayed where she was, doing her best to seem happy and self-contained when she didn't feel either. "Were they good games, dear?" she murmured now, glancing up and seeing Roland nearby once more. "Great, thanks, Granny," Roland said, privately deciding his grandmother wouldn't have thought too highly of Lara Croft's skin-tight outfit and the improbable arsenal of weaponry that had enabled her to save the world. Hearing the ping of his phone in his pocket, he then hastily and surreptitiously checked the message, which turned out to be from Ed. "In pub. Please warn when M&D on way home. Cheers. E." "Someone nice?" inquired Pamela, whose own mobile had yet to be removed from the box in which Peter and Helen had presented it to her with great fanfare 2 Christmases before. "Really," she added on a lovely burst of confidence. "So many phones these days. I don't know what you all find to talk about." At which point Serena, poised and elegant in a grey chiffon dress that made the few threads of silver in her chestnut hair shine like silk, tapped her mother-in-law's shoulder and said it was time they were going home. "On way now," typed Roland, keeping the screen tipped away from his aunt, only to find his mother accosting him from the other side. "Roland, really, put that thing away." "Are we going too, Mum?" he asked hopefully, slipping the mobile into his pocket. "Not quite." Elizabeth smiled in a way that meant she'd drunk enough to start enjoying herself. "We could drop Roland back if he's had enough," offered Serena, unable to resist patting her nephew's glossy dark hair and feeling a swoop of motherly concern at the thought of her darling Ed stuck at home, poring over his history files at the kitchen table. "I don't know why we didn't all come in one car. Silly, really." "No, thanks. I'll stay with Mum," replied Roland grandly, putting an arm round Elizabeth's shoulders. "I'd like to stay to, talk to Aunt Cass a bit. She is my godmother after all." He shifted from one foot to the other, torn between meeting his mother's gaze of gratitude and the more questioning expression on the face of his aunt. "Do you think she enjoyed it?" Serena whispered once they were in the car, glancing over her shoulder at Pamela, who'd fallen asleep, the tartan car blanket tucked under her chin. In the dim light, her mother-in-law's face, dusted still with a few traces of makeup, Pink lipstick, a kiss of lilac eyeshadow. Looked as delicate and pale as that of a china doll.
Hard to tell, but I think so.
Charlie yawned widely and opened the window. The night air, icy even for March, hit his face like a cold shower. God, that's freezing. Do you have to? Sorry, darling, I'm bushed. Charlie began to wind it up, but Serena reached across to stop him. Leave it open. I'll just turn the heating up a little. Charlie left the window open a crack and slowed his speed, in spite of the inviting black ribbon of the A3 under the beam of the headlights. Alone, he would have driven fast in spite of his fatigue, but Serena, he knew, was, for obvious reasons, always on extra alert for the possibility of road accidents. He could feel the fear pulsing out of her, drawing him in. It was 6 years since Tina had been hit by a motorbike on a busy London street. They had coped, moved on. But it had changed them, introduced moments like this, when anxiety at the prospect of misfortune bulged out of all proportion and shadows of pain flitted between them. Good party, wasn't it? He said. I must say, Stephen grows on me. I wasn't sure at first about him and Cassie, different backgrounds and so on, but they really seem good together, don't you think? And he's done bloody well with those books of his. Serena, relaxing as he had intended, kicked off her shoes and flexed her toes in the warm blasts of heat circulating round their feet. I've always liked Stephen, and he's devoted to Cassie, which at the end of the day is all that matters, isn't it? They've settled on a date, by the way, the 14th of January, which I said was fine. They're mad. Whoever heard of a January wedding? What's wrong with the summer? Apparently, Stephen has a book deadline, and Cassie says it will give them enough time to prepare. You know your little sister. She'll want synchronized colour schemes, handmade dresses, and food too beautiful to eat. She's praying for snow too, she said. Snow? You've got to admit it would look nice. St. Margaret's steeple and all the gravestones crusted in white, holly berries and snowdrifts, black ice and breakdown vehicles. I suppose. Serena sighed. Anyway, in terms of family gatherings, the rest of the year is already looking busy enough, what with Italy and Ed's 18th to fit in alongside the usual. The 18th, Charlie frowned. I'd temporarily forgotten that ordeal. Can't we persuade him to have a 21st, put it off for 3 years? The girls had an 18th. True, Charlie admitted ruefully, winding up the window. At least it's after his exams. Once they're out of the way, we might all feel like a party. He's working hard. Is he now? Charlie eyed his wife doubtfully, envying her faith in their easygoing 17-year-old.